There are two numbers that I want you to hold in your mind at the same time. The first number is 25 billion. That is what America has spent on the Iran war so far, according to Pentagon estimates analyzed by Harvard. $25 billion dollars in 62 days, approximately $2 billion dollars per day. That money paid for the B 2 sorties from Missouri, the 12 bunker busters on Fordo, the Tomahawk strikes on Isfahan, the three carrier strike groups, the naval blockade, the 42 vessels redirected, the 311-day deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the entire apparatus of the most expensive military campaign America has run since Iraq. The second number is $23 billion dollars. That is the total amount the United Nations needs to execute what its humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher calls a hyper-prioritized plan to save 87 million lives this year. Food, water, medicine, and shelter for 87 million human beings who are currently facing death from hunger, disease, and conflict. The entire plan. Every person. Every country, 87 million lives, $23 billion. Tom Fletcher stood at Chatham House in London this week and said something I have not been able to stop thinking about. He said, "For every day of this conflict, $2 billion dollars is being spent. My entire target for a hyper prioritized plan to save 87 million lives is 23 billion. We could have funded that in less than a fortnight of this reckless war. And of course, now we cannot. Less than a fortnight. 14 days of the Iran war would have saved 87 million people. America chose to spend that money bombing instead. And now the money is gone, the humanitarian fund is empty, and the UN's budget has been cut by 50%. I teach at the University of Tehran. I have spent 3 decades studying American foreign policy in this region. And I want to say something that I think needs to be said clearly without diplomatic softening on camera in public. This is what the choice looks like, not in the abstract, in the numbers. $25 billion dollars to bomb Iran, $23 billion dollars to save 87 million lives. America chose the $25 billion. Dollars. The 87 million people will not be saved this year, and the war is not over. Let me walk you through exactly what those two numbers mean in the real world. Start with the $25 billion. Dollars. Where did it go? The Harvard analysis of Pentagon numbers confirmed that America has spent approximately $2 billion dollars per day since February 28th. That figure includes the direct costs of the bombing campaign, munitions, sortie costs, fuel, maintenance. It includes the sustained deployment of three carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea. It includes the cost of the naval blockades enforcement operations, the fuel, the personnel, the overhead of maintaining 42 ships on blockade patrol. It includes the special operations missions, including the April 5th insertion near Isfahan that resulted in two MC-130J aircraft having to be destroyed. It includes the intelligence architecture. So the surveillance flights, the signals collection, the satellite tasking, $2 billion dollars per day, every day since February 28th, 62 days, 25 billion and counting. Now, let me tell you what that money has purchased. This is not opinion, this is the measurable outcome. Iran's nuclear program is still running. The uranium stockpile is most likely in the Isfahan tunnel complex, 80 meters underground, where America's largest conventional bombs cannot reach. The IAEA has not been able to verify the location of Iran's highly enriched uranium for 9 months. The program that 25 billion was spent to dismantle is still intact. Iran's government is functioning, a new supreme leader is in place, the IRGC is still controlling Hormuz. The ceasefire that ended the bombing phase was based on Iran's 10-point plan, not America's conditions. The government that 25 billion was spent to pressure is conducting active foreign policy, sending its foreign minister to 4 countries in 72 hours and issuing statements about new legal frameworks for managing the Strait of Hormuz. Hormuz is still closed. The 20% of the world's traded oil that passes through that 34-kilometer channel has been restricted since February 28th. The IEA calls it the worst oil supply shock in history. Oil is at $114 after touching $126 this week. Gas in America is at $4.30 per gallon. The strait that $25 billion was spent to reopen is still closed. $25 billion. Iran's nuclear program intact. Iran's government intact. Hormuz closed. The three things America went to war to change remain unchanged. Now, let me tell you what $23 billion would have purchased. Not could purchase, would have purchased, past tense. The money is gone now. Tom Fletcher has spent weeks in crisis zones explaining what 23 billion looks like when it reaches people who need it. He was in Somalia this week. He has been in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Sudan. He is describing what he sees with his own eyes in Gaza. An estimated 3.6 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance right now, requiring approximately $4.1 billion. That is 4.1 billion of the 23 billion. Gaza's crossing at Rafah is still closed. Medical evacuations have been suspended. The United Nations can bring in only half the fuel needed to sustain basic operations. Two-thirds of Gaza's population lives in displacement camps. This is a humanitarian emergency that existed before February 28th and has been made catastrophically worse by the energy crisis this war has produced in Lebanon. The UN Refugee Agency estimates close to 700,000 people have been displaced in the current escalation. Hundreds of schools and public buildings serve as shelters, most already beyond capacity. Syrian refugees who fled to Lebanon for safety are now fleeing back to Syria because Lebanon can no longer support them. More than 30,000 people crossed from Lebanon into Syria in a single week. Over a million people total have been displaced in Lebanon since the war began, according to IOM. This is happening in a country already in economic collapse before the war started. The Lebanon humanitarian gap requires approximately $12 billion total across the current crisis period. In Yemen, 23.1 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. This is not a new crisis. Yemen has been in a humanitarian catastrophe since 2015. The UN has received close to $30 billion for Yemen over the past decade, but the current funding shortfall is acute. $2.5 billion is needed this year. The oil price shock from Iran's war has increased the cost of every humanitarian program in Yemen because all of those programs run on fuel and logistics that price in oil. The war that started in Iran is making Yemen's crisis more expensive to respond to while simultaneously destroying the budgets available to respond. In Syria, 16.5 million people are in need. $3.2 billion required this year. The post conflict reconstruction bill for Syria alone is $216 billion. Syria receives 22 to 43% of total global humanitarian assistance in any given year. When the global humanitarian budget collapses, which it is doing right now with the UN's budget cut by 50%, Syria's situation deteriorates because Syria has nowhere else to turn. In Sudan, in Myanmar, in Somalia, where Tom Fletcher spent this week talking to people who are surviving day to day. In every crisis zone in the world, the oil price shock from the Iran war is raising the cost of humanitarian programs, while the American decision to cut foreign aid is reducing the budget available. The UN's humanitarian chief is watching both things happen simultaneously while calculating that 14 days of the Iran war would have saved the 87 million people his agency cannot now reach. Let me tell you what the UN budget cut means in practice because the 50% figure is abstract until you understand what it is cutting. Tom Fletcher said this at Chatham House. We're already overstretched, under-resourced, and literally under attack. He said more than 1,000 humanitarians have been killed in conflicts around the world over the past 3 years. More than half of them were killed during Israel's operations in Gaza and the West Bank. 1,000 dead humanitarians in 3 years, he said. When did that become normal? The Trump administration's latest budget request calls for another $2 billion in cuts to humanitarian assistance and just over $4 billion in cuts to global health programs, including what Fletcher described as cutting funding to the world's birth control and therapy. He said those cuts have life and death consequences, and that in all of the crisis areas he works in, the impact falls most heavily on women and girls, on mothers and babies. These are not abstractions. These are specific programs that are disappearing. The World Food Program feeds 100 million people. It runs on donations. When America cuts its contribution, 100 million people get less food. UNHCR runs refugee camps. When its budget is cut by 50%, camp residents get less clean water. The Global Fund fights AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. When it loses American support, people who need medication do not get it, and they die. Meanwhile, America is spending $2 billion a day on a war that has not achieved its stated objectives. I want to be precise about the moral weight of that comparison. I am not saying the security concerns that drove the decision to go to war were invented. I teach international relations. I understand that states make security calculations and that those calculations sometimes lead to the use of force. What I am saying is that the cost of those calculations has to be accounted for honestly. When Tom Fletcher says $23 billion could have saved 87 million lives, and $25 billion was spent on a war that has not achieved its stated objectives, that is a moral accounting that cannot be avoided by citing security concerns. Security decisions have humanitarian consequences. The decision to spend $2 billion a day on this war is simultaneously a decision to not spend $2 billion a day on food, water, medicine, and shelter for people who will die without it. Both of those decisions are made by the same government in the same budget using the same dollars. The security decision and the humanitarian consequence are not separate. They are two faces of the same choice. Let me now tell you about the cascade effect. Because the $23 billion figure is not just about direct aid, it is about the way this war is multiplying the cost of every humanitarian operation on Earth simultaneously. Oil is at $114 per barrel. Before this war, it was $72. That $40 difference is not just a number on a futures screen, it is the price of fuel for every humanitarian logistics operation in the world. When Doctors Without Borders flies medical supplies to South Sudan, the aircraft runs on fuel. When the World Food Program trucks food to famine zones in the Sahel, the trucks run on fuel. When UNHCR moves tents and blankets to displacement camps in Lebanon, the vehicles run on fuel. Every single humanitarian operation on Earth that involves moving anything from one place to another runs on fuel. And fuel is now 58% more expensive than it was on February 27th. The Middle East Council on Global Affairs published a detailed analysis estimating that Yemen's humanitarian operation requires 2.5 billion this year. That number was calculated at pre-war oil prices. At 114 oil, the logistics cost of that operation is substantially higher. The food that $2.5 billion was supposed to buy does not go as far when the fuel to truck it costs 58% more. The tents that $3.2 billion was supposed to provide for Syria's 16.5 million people in need cost more to manufacture and more to ship when oil is $114. Every humanitarian budget calculated before February 28th is now insufficient by a margin that tracks directly to the oil price caused by the closure of Hormuz. This is the cascade. The war produces the oil crisis. The oil crisis raises the cost of every humanitarian operation. The raised cost arrives at the same moment that the humanitarian budget has been cut by 50%. The people who depend on those operations pay the difference in hunger, in disease, in preventable death. Tom Fletcher said the money was not there for humanitarian work because people were finding it for other things. He was describing this exact cascade. $2 billion per day found for the war, $23 billion not found for the 87 million. The finding and the not finding happen in the same government budget discussions, around the same tables, by the same people who signed both the military appropriations and the foreign aid cuts. The cascade does not stop at the current moment. The IEA has released 400 million barrels of strategic petroleum reserves from its 32 member countries in an attempt to lower oil prices. That 400 million barrel release is the world's buffer against the worst effects of the oil supply shock. It is finite. When it runs out, if Hormuz is still closed, the oil price spikes again. And every humanitarian operation that adjusted its budget to $114 oil will face $130 oil. And every life saved at 114 oil will be at risk again. Let me tell you about Somalia specifically because Tom Fletcher was there this week and his description of what he saw deserves to be heard in detail. Somalia is not in the Iran war. Somalia has no proxies in the Strait of Hormuz. Somalia did not vote on the UN Security Council resolution about the blockade. Somalia has no relationship to the nuclear question at the center of the US Iran standoff. Somalia's crisis is entirely its own drought, famine, decades of state collapse, clan conflict, and the pressure of a growing population in a country that cannot feed itself. And yet Somalia is on the list of countries where Tom Fletcher says 87 million lives could have been saved for $23 billion. Somalia's famine conditions affect millions of people. The World Food Program feeds 3.8 million Somalis monthly. That operation runs on fuel. The fuel costs more now. The budget that funds it has been cut by 50%. The 3.8 million Somalis who depend on it are not receiving the same level of support they received on February 27th. Fletcher said from Mogadishu this week that if we could show an ounce of the courage and dignity and generosity to each other that the people on the front lines of these crises show to each other, then we would not be in this catastrophic mess globally. He said, people are finding the money for other things. He said that when people tell me the money is not there, it enrages me, infuriates me. The people on the front lines in Somalia know nothing about the technical details of Iran's uranium enrichment. They know about hunger. They know about the cost of food. They know about what happens when the truck with the food stops coming because the fuel ran out, because the oil price went up, because a war started in a country they have never visited for reasons that were never explained to them. That is what $25 billion looks like from Mogadishu. That is what the choice to spend $2 billion per day on a war costs when it is paid for, not just in dollars, but in the lives of people who are 3 or 4 cascades removed from the decision that produced it. Now, let me tell you about what this war has done to the humanitarian situation, specifically inside Iran, because the coverage of the economic and military dimensions has almost entirely crowded out the human dimension. The Council on Foreign Relations published a detailed analysis in March that said U.S. Israeli attacks have temporarily displaced up to 3.2 million people within Iran since the start of the conflict. 3.2 million people displaced inside a country of 90 million. That is not a statistic. That is 3.2 million people who left their homes because bombs were falling, who are living with relatives in shelters, in improvised accommodations, without their possessions, without their routines, without their sense of security. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned that Iran cannot become another Syria, emphasizing efforts to prevent a new wave of refugees from reaching Europe. He said that with a population of 90 million, even a 10% outflow from Iran would make it one of the largest refugee crises since World War II. 9 million people from one country, potentially, if the war continues and the economic collapse accelerates. The UN's International Organization for Migration has deployed 38 supply hubs globally to respond to the current crisis. It is running emergency operations in Lebanon, where over 1 million people have been displaced. It is tracking movements in Iran. It is operating in Yemen. It is trying to function with a budget that has been cut in half, while the crises it is responding to have multiplied. Inside Iran, 70% inflation is the daily reality for 90 million people. The rial has lost more than half its value. The economy is contracting at 6.1%. These numbers describe an economic environment in which ordinary people cannot afford food, medicine, or the basic requirements of maintaining a family. The UN's own assessment is that Iran and Lebanon together have seen more than 5,000 deaths, including thousands of civilians, and more than 4 million people displaced collectively. 4 million people displaced across Iran and Lebanon, 5,000 dead, including thousands of civilians. These are the human consequences of the military and economic decisions that have consumed $25 billion. And Tom Fletcher is in Somalia watching people die from hunger because the $23 billion that could have saved 87 million people was spent on the war that produced those 4 million displaced people instead. There is one more dimension I need to address before the steel man. Tom Fletcher raised it at Chatham House, and it has received almost no coverage. He said, beyond the financial toll, U.S. actions may have done irreparable damage to the authority of international humanitarian law and to UN bodies tasked with enforcing it. Irreparable, not temporary, irreparable. International humanitarian law is the body of rules governing how wars are fought. The Geneva Conventions, the Hague Regulations, the protocols on civilian protection, and the prohibition on targeting civilian infrastructure. These rules exist because the world decided, after 2 world wars, that there had to be limits on what states could do to each other's civilians, even when at war. The Iran war has tested those limits at every stage. U.S. strikes on power plants and bridges, civilian infrastructure. The UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk confirmed at least 21 people executed in Iran since February 28th, 9 connected to protests. The IAEA called for maximum restraint after nuclear facilities were targeted. The UN Secretary General made the same call after a power plant incident in early April. Fletcher's point is deeper than specific incidents. He is saying that when the world's most powerful country wages a war and ignores the normative obligations underpinning the international system, it damages not just the specific institutions it defunds or ignores, but the entire idea that those institutions have binding authority. If the UN's humanitarian budget can be cut by 50% while $2 billion per day is spent on bombing, the message is that the humanitarian system is optional, funded when convenient, defunded when not. That message, once sent, cannot be easily unsent. The damage to international humanitarian law from this war will outlast the war itself. And the 1,000 humanitarians killed in the line of duty in 3 years, which Fletcher asked about at Chatham House, when did that become normal? Is the human face of what happens when that authority erodes. Let me address the argument that security concerns justify the cost, because I believe it deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal. The argument is this: Iran's nuclear program presented a genuine existential threat to Israel and a serious strategic threat to American interests in the region. A country with 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity and a 12-day breakout timeline was approaching the threshold of nuclear weapons capability. That threat, if not addressed, could produce consequences far more catastrophic than a humanitarian funding shortfall. The war's costs, including the humanitarian costs, are real, but they are less than the cost of allowing Iran to become a nuclear-armed state. This is a coherent argument made by serious people. I do not dismiss it. I teach at a university that studies exactly this kind of strategic calculation. Here is where the argument breaks down in this specific case. Iran's uranium is still in Iran. The IAEA still cannot verify its location. Iran's nuclear program is still running. The Supreme Leader's statement this week explicitly declared nuclear and missile capabilities to be national assets, guarded like territory, not to be traded in any negotiation. The security threat that justified the war has not been eliminated by the war. It has been hardened. Iran's government has more reason now than before February 28th to protect its nuclear capability, because the capability that America bombed it for having is now demonstrably the thing that gives Iran leverage in the standoff. Surrendering it would mean surrendering the leverage. The war cost $25 billion. The security threat it was supposed to address is still present. And 87 million people cannot be saved this year because the money that would have saved them was spent on a campaign that has not produced the security outcome it was launched to deliver. Tom Fletcher said the money could have saved those lives in less than a fortnight. He is right. He is also watching the money disappear into a blockade that America's own officials describe as a high-risk bid with no guarantee of success. I have spent 30 years studying this region. I have watched the human cost of these decisions accumulate in the faces of ordinary people in countries that were never part of the calculation that put them at risk. I have watched 87 million people become a number in a UN budget appeal, while $25 billion becomes a line item in a Pentagon estimate. I have watched Tom Fletcher stand at Chatham House and say, when did 1,000 dead humanitarians become normal? The answer to that question, when did it become normal, is the most important question of our time. And the two numbers at the center of this video are the clearest way I know to describe why it became normal. $25 billion to bomb, $23 billion to save. America chose the bombing. America. The 87 million people will not be saved this year. I will see you in the next one.